Hey, here's every manga that I've read so far in 2023 ranked from worst to best. Here we go. In sixth place, I got What a Wonderful World. So this is a short story collection by Inio Asano. He's the guy who did Goodnight Pun Pun and Solanin and Dead Demons, Destruction, and all that other good stuff. So he's known for writing stuff that's really sad, right? All his stuff's really sad, and I guess I'm just like a fan of feeling terrible, because I've made it a goal of mine to read everything that this man has ever written. Now, I've read a good amount of his manga already, but it's taken me a while to get to What a Wonderful World, because most people say it's not really his best work. And now that I've read it, I kind of agree. I'd say it's definitely the worst thing I've read from him, but you know what? He's a solid writer. You know, I wouldn't be trying to read everything he's ever written if I thought he was trash or anything. And his worst work, it's still pretty solid. So yeah, What a Wonderful World. It's a short story collection, and that's probably the main reason why it just didn't hit that hard for me. Because short story collections are just hard to do, especially in manga. Each of these stories, they take like 5 minutes to read, and it's really hard to write something good that's that short. You get what I'm saying? And on top of that, this is one of his earlier works, and it's clear he's still figuring out his style, because the dialogue doesn't have the same flow as in his later work, and some of the character moments just don't have the weight that they were probably supposed to. This is also far and away the most optimistic Inio Asano work I've ever read, which is something, because optimistic and Inio Asano are just not phrases you often hear together. The majority of the stories in here were just kind of okay, and I've already forgotten most of them, to be honest. But there's still some good ones in here. It's still worth checking out. My favorite, it was about this conversation between this school kid and his bully. And that one just had a rawness to it, right? It had this authenticity that got to me a bit. There's also a story about a guy who dresses up as a bear and mugs people, so that's cool. If you like Inio Asano, you'll like this. Just don't go into it expecting Goodnight Pun Pun levels of quality or anything. In fifth place, I got Naruto volumes 49 to 52. Now, there's going to be some light spoilers here since I'm 52 volumes deep. So if you've never read Naruto and you want to go in blind, then maybe skip to the next series I talk about. Now, Naruto, it's only this low on the list because, like I said, I only read 4 volumes. And it's hard to compare 4 volumes of a series to some of the other stuff you'll see later on this list, which are complete whole series. So if I was ranking all of Naruto, it would be a lot higher up on the list. These 4 volumes make up the 5 Kage Summit arc. It's that one where all the ninja leader people meet and then Sasuke beats a bunch of people up. So yeah, I thought this arc was great, because, you know, a lot of stuff happened and it was all very good. The world got fleshed out a bit, the story took some interesting turns, the fight scenes were great, some plot threads also got resolved, and some story arcs just came together a lot quicker than I expected them to. Particularly for Sasuke, who just had like multiple big character milestones that I wasn't expecting him to hit until later on. So yeah, Naruto, it's great. I'm nearing the end of the series, and I'm sure that when I'm done with it, it'll just go down as one of my favorite shonens of all time. Fourth place is Tatsuki Fujimoto 17 to 21. Now, this is a collection of short stories that Tatsuki Fujimoto wrote when he was between ages 17 and 21, hence the name. Now, I said earlier in this video that manga short stories are super hard to write, and they're especially hard to write when you're as young as the author was when he wrote these. And yet, I enjoyed all these short stories a lot. Now, these short stories definitely aren't perfect. You can tell that they're written by someone who is pretty young, and the first story in particular just might be the messiest published manga I've ever read. But yet, I just had so much fun reading these, because there's this youthful joy to them that's missing from most authors' more polished work. Reading these was like listening to Nirvana's first album that they put out when they were all super young. Like, it's not as good as their later stuff, but there's just a certain quality to it that nothing else they ever put out was able to capture. And it's still a great album. So yeah, like that, even though these short stories are simpler and less refined than Fujimoto's later stuff, they're still really good. And they aren't just a curiosity that you pick up because you want to read what the Chainsaw Man guy wrote when he was young. Nah, these short stories, they stand on their own, and they're worth reading regardless of the author's other accomplishments. I remember all the stories in here really well, and I had a blast reading them, but if I had to pick my favorite, it would be the second one. It's just bonkers in the best way, and it has this ambiguity to it that Fujimoto's later work would become known for. Another collection of short stories from Fujimoto is coming out in a couple months, and it's honestly my most anticipated manga release of this year. In third place, I got Umineko, particularly episodes 4 and 5 of the series. So Umineko, it's 8 parts long. I'm officially past the halfway point, but the parts just keep getting longer and longer, so it might take me a while to finish this. Also, even though I'm in the middle of this series, I'm not going to spoil anything because not enough people have read Umineko. It is slept on, and I'm not trying to give away the whole story for people who haven't read it yet, because that would just be mean, you know? So there's a lot going on in Umineko, but at its core, it's basically about a bunch of murders that happen on this island. And one character claims that the murders were committed supernaturally by an evil witch, and another character claims that there is nothing supernatural about the murders and that they're all committed by a human. And so they make it their goal to prove the other wrong, and they spend a lot of the series arguing. There's a whole lot of arguing going on, but it's kind of cool because these arguments are kind of depicted as fight scenes, right? Like you'll have dudes yelling stuff like, "I reject your supposition," while stabbing a guy in the chest, and you got people that fire guns that are powered by logic. Okay, it sounds kind of stupid, but trust me, it's fun, right? It's a fun time, and there's this whole vibe where you don't really know what's real and what's not, and I'm just a big fan of stuff like that. That's the basic setup of the story. Obviously, a lot more happens than that because the series is like 50-some volumes long. There's a lot of twists and turns and crazy stuff, but I'm just not trying to spoil everything, you know? But anyway, parts 4 and 5, the series is just as great as always. Episode 4, it started out a little slow, but it worked out because it built up to probably the most emotional moment in the series so far, so that was good. And then episode 5, it introduced this new character who really spiced up the story. I'm liking them a lot. They're adding a lot. And yeah, I feel like that's about all I can say. You just got to go read it. Just go check it out because it's great. In second place, I got Peepo Choo. Now you might be wondering, what the heck is this? What is this nonsense here? All right, backstory time. I gotta give you a backstory on this one. So I've been trying to collect this super out of print manga called GTO The Early Years. And it's just been a demoralizing experience because I can't find volume 8 for anything less than $650. But I've gotten my hands on some of the less expensive volumes, and I was flipping through one of them, and I saw this ad for a manga called Peepo Choo. Now, I'd heard of this series for years, but I always brushed it off because the name sounded really dumb. But this ad, right, it had this picture of this buff Jason Voorhees looking Splatterhouse on Sega Genesis looking masked man, and this guy just looked so cool that I had to go and read the series. So I did, and I had a great time. The phrase hidden gem is definitely thrown around a lot more than it should, but if any series could be described as a hidden gem, it would be Peepo Choo. So this series is only 3 volumes. I read the whole thing in one sitting, and the story is basically about this kid named Milton. He lives in Chicago, and he's just obsessed with this anime called Peepo Choo. Because, you know, it's a parody of Pokemon, you know, Pikachu, Peepo. Yeah, anyway, Milton, he's obsessed with this show, and since he's an idiot, he thinks that this goofy animated kids show is just a totally realistic reflection of Japanese culture. So it's his dream to go to Japan. And he gets his wish when he wins this free trip to Japan from a raffle held by his local comic book store. So he goes to Japan with the owner of the comic book store, and it turns out that this comic book store owner is secretly that cool buff masked man, and he's known among the criminal underworld as this unstoppable killing machine. And the whole real reason for the trip was because this comic book store owner was hired to kill some Yakuza members. So, of course, Milton, he gets wrapped up in all this, and shenanigans ensue, and it's a good time. So this series is written by Felipe Smith, who's lived in both America and Japan, among other places, and because of this, Peepo Choo feels a bit like a mix of both manga and American comics, but in a good way, The art style definitely pulls inspiration from both manga and comics, while the dialogue feels very American, as well as the depiction of violence. Because manga violence is often very stylized, but this series has this gritty, meaty violence to it that's more in line with something you'd see in a Vertigo comic like Preacher. But the pacing and the paneling are also more in line with the manga style, and the story just has this level of insanity to it that feels very manga. And Peepo Choo is definitely insane. Don't read this if you're under 18, because it's incredibly graphic. But there's just nothing else like it. There's brutal Yakuza action, there's coming-of-age drama, there's high school romance, there's really funny comedy. There's just a lot going on here, and it all comes together really well. The cast of characters is just super lovable. I don't think I've ever read a manga series this short where I missed the characters as much as I did when it was over. I just wish that this series went on forever. And finally, the best series I've read so far this year, and one of the best manga I've ever read in my life, it's Ashita no Joe. So Ashita no Joe translates to Tomorrow's Joe, but most people just call it by its Japanese name because, Tomorrow's Joe sounds a little goofy. But anyway, this is a boxing manga from the 60s, and it's super influential, and it gets referenced in a whole lot of manga today. So, after years of hearing about how legendary it was and all that, I just decided to read it myself, and I read about 2 volumes, and I thought it was the most boring thing I'd ever read in my life. So I stopped reading it for over a year and never thought about it again until for some weird reason, a couple weeks ago, I just had a hankering to go back and give it another try. And boy, am I glad I did, because I sped through the remaining 18 volumes of the series in less than a week. So Ashita no Joe starts off with our main character, Joe Yabuki, and he's a bit of a hoodlum. He's wreaking havoc, and he's getting into fistfights with shady people, and he's just not a nice guy. But then Donpei, who's this one-eyed old alcoholic who lives under a bridge, Donpei sees potential in the way that Joe fights, and he wants to train him to become a professional boxer. Now, Joe turns him down because he's a jerk, but then Joe later gets arrested for tax fraud or something bizarre like that. I don't know. It's been a while since I read that part. But anyway, while he's in jail, Joe meets Rikishi, an ex-professional boxer, and the one person Joe can't beat in a fight. So out of straight, pure jealousy, Joe takes Donpei up on his offer, and he trains to become a boxer just so that he can one day be stronger than Rikishi. So yeah, the very beginning of this series is just Joe running around town, beating up random hoodlums and engaging in various bits of tomfoolery, and I just didn't care for it at all. It also didn't help that this series was never officially released in English, and the only fan translation you can find online is very, very bad until around chapter 50. But once Rikishi is introduced in volume 3 and they actually start boxing and stuff, the series takes off and never slows down. At its core, Ashita no Joe is one of the best character dramas in all of manga. It's the story of 2 men who would give up everything for their dreams, and it asks the question of whether these dreams are worth giving up everything for. I loved the cast of this series, even though they often do things that are just incredibly unlikable. They're flawed characters in the best, most human, most real way. This isn't a particularly happy story, and the characters went down paths that I really, really did not want them to go down. And they made incredibly bad decisions that had me practically screaming at the page, but the fact that they made me that upset proves that they made me care. All the best stories are incredibly gripping in the moment, and they have enough depth that they leave you thinking about them long after you're done reading. This holds true for Ashita no Joe. This is one of the most gripping manga I've ever read. While reading some of these boxing matches, I was almost sweating. I was feeling all jittery and stuff. And the ending of this series, it's the most famous ending in all of manga. It's definitely an ending that I'll be thinking about for a very long time. The final panel is going to be etched into my mind forever. So there it is. That's every manga I read in January and February 2023. If If you've read these series, let me know what you thought of them down in the comments below. And if you haven't read them, go check them out. They're all pretty good. You'll probably like them. I hope you liked the video, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. See ya.